Hello, students in Paul as Local Theologian. This is another video lecture, and as we have done with a previous video lecture on 1 Thessalonians, this video lecture is on one of Paul's letters, in this case 1 Corinthians, and I'm considering this prospects of Paul as local theologian in 1 Corinthians. I think of all of Paul's letters, 1 Corinthians may be the letter that most lends itself to local theology or to connections with local theology, since it is such a responsive document. And so with this brief lecture, I want to provide a brief orientation of 1 Corinthians and to the city of Corinth, provide an outline or an overview of the content in 1 Corinthians, and then focus a little bit on Paul's theological reasoning, his doing theology in this responsive way. First, by way of orientation, I want to begin with the city of Corinth, the city that is the recipient of this first letter to the Corinthians. Corinth was a Roman colony and the capital of the province of Achaia. Though it had previously been a Greek city, Corinth had actually been rebuilt and recolonized about 100 years before Paul visits and founds the church there. The location of Corinth made the city an ideal location for sea commerce, and therefore we could think of it as something like a cosmopolitan city, at least by ancient world standards. As the HarperCollins introduction puts it, Corinth was a large and prospering urban center with an ethnically, culturally, and religiously diverse population. So again, if we think in modern terms, Corinth was probably more like Atlanta or New York City than a more rural or out-of-the-way country or city. So it's important to note at the outset that Corinth was ethnically, culturally, and religiously diverse, and that's part of the work that Paul is going to be doing in his letter. Now, there is, I think, an old tradition in scholarship that associated Corinth with having a particularly bad reputation for raucous living. While I think that there are some ancient sources that support this idea, and maybe there's some truth to the idea, it's probably an overstatement. It's probably unlikely that the inhabitants of Corinth were more inclined to sexually promiscuous living or partying or anything else. I think that sometimes there's an association of Corinth with like a Las Vegas. But I think, again, that's an interesting analogy because Las Vegas has maybe some particular things that make it unique, but you don't have to go out of your way to find similarly problematic or immoral living in any other large city in the U.S., right? And so while I think that there is an older tradition of really highlighting how bad life was on the ground in Corinth, it's probably a bit of an overstatement, and it's probably better for us to think that that Corinth, like any other large city in the ancient world, had its own share of diverse lifestyles that were deemed problematic by some, but that there might not have been anything particular about Corinth that made it so bad. In terms of the letter, 1 Corinthians itself, we can say a little bit about its date and occasion. It's most likely written around 54 CE to a community that Paul had founded some 5 years earlier. So sometime in the late 40s or early 50s, Paul visits Corinth and founds the community. We can see how Luke remembers this experience in Acts chapter 18, verses 1 through 18. According to the final chapter of 1 Corinthians, Paul says that he is writing from Ephesus, and he expresses his plans to visit the Corinthians at some point in the future. By and large, we can understand all of 1 Corinthians, or a good bit of 1 Corinthians, as a responsive letter, as I said in the beginning. Paul says that he is himself responding to a letter that the Corinthians sent to him, and it seems like we can find places in 1 Corinthians where Paul is directly engaging that letter. Of course, we don't have that letter, unfortunately, that we don't have access to that letter. It has not been preserved. So we only get this one side of Paul's conversation with the Corinthians. In addition to this letter that he received from the Corinthians, Paul has actually also received something like a delegate identified as Chloe's people in 1 Corinthians 1:11, which are very likely the slaves and the household members of Chloe, who was perhaps the patron of the community, maybe even the one whose house was used for one of the gatherings of the community. And so Paul gets more information and more questions from Chloe's people that he then responds to in the letter. The final thing that I want to say by way of introduction or orientation to 1 Corinthians has to do with the search for a center. One of the things that animates New Testament scholars and theologians to some degree is an effort to identify the sort of controlling center or the singular theme that holds 1 Corinthians together. As you can imagine, because of its responsive nature, this can be actually quite difficult to ascertain. I want to highlight two suggestions, and then I want to revisit the question itself. So one suggestion by a New Testament scholar who teaches at the University of Chicago Divinity School, Margaret Mitchell, has argued that all of 1 Corinthians from 1 through 16 can be understood in one form or fashion as a call to unity. Paul is trying his best to get the Corinthians to stop dividing and separating themselves. And we can see kind of how that matches up. There's language about alternative leadership structures in the first 4 chapters. Paul talks about spiritual gifts and judging each other and doing what's making up for building and so forth. And so Margaret Mitchell says the center is this call to unity. And if we center there, then we can understand sort of what is outside of that center, and then how all of the parts relate. Karl Barth, the famous Swiss theologian, actually argued that all of 1 Corinthians can be understood from the framework of chapter 15, which deals with the resurrection of the body. And Karl Barth says this isn't just an appendix, this isn't just an afterthought for Paul in 1 Corinthians. This is actually the sort of core of the letter. And that if you read all of 1 Corinthians with 15 in mind, what you see is that Paul is actually very interested in the physical body and what Christians in Corinth are doing with their physical bodies. And so that the discussion of the resurrection of the body in chapter 15 is really the exclamation point to a lot of Paul's theological work earlier in the letter. I think either of these are helpful suggestions, and they're just two of a variety of options. But one of the things that I would invite us to consider is for this class is that maybe one of the major implications of thinking about Paul as a local theologian is that we actually don't need to identify a center or a core to 1 Corinthians. Maybe it's okay for us to say Paul's responsive writing, his responsive style, is itself the theology. That's where Paul's doing the theological work. That is where Paul is performing theological reflection. Sometimes in the specialists of Paul, you'll get this sort of dichotomy between Paul's responsive topics and then his more serious theology, right? As if the two are unrelated. And I think local theology really invites us to say, no, let's pay attention to the specifics and to the responsive nature of Paul's letters, because that's where theology is done. It's not done in some abstract, objective treatise, but it's actually in the sort of messiness of daily life that Paul does his theological work. And I think 1 Corinthians gives us access to that, maybe better than any of his other letters. I want to say something about the outline of 1 Corinthians 15. I think that you should plan to read all of 1 Corinthians, ideally in one setting. It can be done in just about an hour, maybe a little bit more if you read in one sitting. But so I want to give you an overview of this letter. It has a very typical letter opening in chapter 1, and then in chapters 1 through 4, we see Paul dealing with what I would call community and division and questions of authority, but also how the message of Jesus' crucifixion sort of speaks to that and speaks to power dynamics and claims to wisdom and claims to authority and so forth. So that's chapters 1 through 4. Then in chapters 5 through 14, really almost the rest of the letter, Paul is responding to a variety of topics. These, again, are topics that have been raised by the letter that the Corinthians sent to Paul, as well as the report that he's received from Chloe's people. Now, within this response, we can see two important subsections. The first is a very long, and I would say pastoral response to the question of eating meat sacrificed to idols in 1 Corinthians 8 through 10. As a reminder, meat was hard to come by in the ancient world, and almost all of it was most likely used in some sort of religious ritual prior to being made available to the masses in the meat market. And so there was a conflicted relationship with Jews and Christians who thought that pagan worship that required animal sacrifice might have contaminated or done something to the meat. And so Paul is dealing with that situation in 1 Corinthians 8 through 10. And then in 1 Corinthians 11 through 14, again, another sustained discourse, a sustained dialogue, where Paul is wrestling with how the community gathers together, how they worship together, how they eat together, how they exercise their spiritual gifts together. And it's, again, a pretty consistent and solid discussion in 1 Corinthians 11 through 14. In 1 Corinthians 15, as I mentioned earlier, this is the chapter on the resurrection of the body. And then in chapter 16, we have Paul's typical closing, where he shares his travel plans as well as greeting some of the Christians in Corinth and sharing greetings from where he is at in Ephesus. In terms of the issues that we see Paul dealing with in 1 Corinthians, again, I've mentioned the issue of leadership and authority in chapters 1 through 4. He talks about how to settle disputes among believers in chapter 6. He talks about sex and marriage in chapters 5 and 7. And he spends 3 chapters on meat sacrifice to idols in 8 through 10, and another 4 chapters about worship together in 11 through 14. Now, there's 2 things I think for our purposes, for this class and more broadly, that are important with regard to these issues. The first is that Paul throughout has a community focus, an other focus, a focus on the other. So instead of exercising one's individual rights or one's individual preferences, Paul consistently invites the Corinthians to think about the wellness and the upbuilding of another. This is the heart of love, according to Paul. This is what love in community looks like. It looks like the benefit of another, and it looks like upbuilding the other. The second thing that I would point out is that a number of these issues, a number of these topics, are not particularly or inherently theological in nature. These are not questions about how Jesus is divine or how the Trinity works or what is the nature of salvation or the afterlife or hope. They're not weighty theological topics that we might see in a systematic treatise. Instead, they are primarily practical. They're the sorts of things that, if you're a Presbyterian, they're the sorts of things that might be handled as an omnibus motion in a session meeting. They're the sorts of things that we don't discourse. They're the things that we don't talk about. And yet Paul invests them with some really significant theological weight and freight. And so pay attention to that. A second thing that I would say about these issues is that he frames almost all of the responses with a commitment to unity and upbuilding. How can the Corinthians be united when everything seems to be pulling them in the direction of division? And how can they work? How can they respond? How can they organize their life in a way that builds up the other? And I think inherent to that, or at least a subtext to that, is how can we build up the least among us, right? That I think we see in a number of ways. So our divisions have a tendency of exalting individuals or exalting a minority, a dominant minority, perhaps we would say, while what Paul advocates for is upbuilding instead of tearing down and considering the least among them. Let me conclude then with the question of local theology, 1 Corinthians and local theology. Now, I think that the article, the chapter from the Global Bible Commentary that we will be reading this week helps us think through some of these questions about local theology, and certainly illustrates for us how 1 Corinthians can be used in a local context to do the work of theology. But I think there are some open questions for me about 1 Corinthians and local theology. The first is just how local is local, right? How local does it mean to count as local theology? Is Paul dealing with Gentile culture in a sort of general way, or is it specific to Corinth, to the city of Corinth, and does it matter? Again, I think the chapter from the Global Bible Commentary here is illustrative. We could say that the author in that article, by talking about India, is very much talking about a local context, local in the sense of talking about how Christianity looks in the country of India. But of course, we could go narrower, right? We could go smaller. We could talk about a city or a region of India that would make it even more local. But I think what counts is that it doesn't necessarily, we don't have to make a decision about whether the issues in 1 Corinthians are only relevant to Corinth, as much as we might say that they are local to a Gentile culture or to a Roman urban environment in the first century. That I still think counts as local. I think in addition to that, we could say that many of the issues, many of the responses that Paul is dealing with are very local. They're very responsive in nature, right? So the argument about leadership and authority, or the discord between what the Global Bible Commentary calls those who are overly licentious and those who are proto-Gnostic as it relates to moral practices and how they live and how they organize themselves. Maybe the discussion of meat sacrificed to idols has a particularly local flavor to it, or even Paul's discussion of the Lord's Supper in chapter 11. I think that there are other places where we might see local theology at work. Again, that final chapter in chapter 15, or it's the second to last chapter in chapter 15, where Paul deals with the resurrection of the body. Very often, I think this is treated as a sort of a treatise or a discourse on the resurrected body. But what if we think about this as being embedded within the larger argument of 1 Corinthians, like Karl Barth suggests? That, I think, gives it a more local or responsive flavor to it. Another very vexing issue as it relates to 1 Corinthians is what Paul says about women in the worshiping community in chapter 11 and chapter 14. How do we make sense of this? Are these valid arguments, are these valid instructions, but perhaps only limited to Corinth? Are they hyper-local, in other words? And this might explain why Paul says some pretty restrictive things about women's speaking in chapter 14. And then in chapter 11, he seems to be assuming that they're participating in public worship. And elsewhere in Paul's letters, we know that Paul had and supported the leadership of women. So how do we make sense of this? One way of making sense of it would be to say it's hyper-local. There was something going on in the city of Corinth, perhaps with other pagan religious practices or religious groups that caused Paul to come down in such a forceful way in chapter 14. I think the other thing is just it highlights the messiness of Paul's letters, and that Paul is dealing with individual communities and giving them advice. And so when he commends women in Romans 16 at a place that he's never visited but he knows by reputation, how do we balance that with these harsh and limiting words of 1 Corinthians 14? And how do we balance both of those realities with what Paul says about gender relations in Galatians 3:28? Again, it's messy, and local theology may give us some insights into that messiness, or it may not. But I wonder, this is an open question for me, is does local theology help us understand the issue of women in 1 Corinthians 14 especially. That is my video lecture on 1 Corinthians and local theology. I do hope that it has been a helpful orientation to 1 Corinthians, maybe reminding you of some things, but also that it will help you as you read and engage 1 Corinthians as well as the chapter from the Global Bible Commentary. I look forward to hearing your thoughts in this week's discussion forum and wish you all a very good and happy week. Thanks for your time and your attention.